The Russian Federation invaded Ukraine over 6 months ago, and in that time frame, they've lost a lot of good, able-bodied men. So the question is, can they replace those men? Could they go through with something like full mobilization? What about the shadow mobilization that they're doing, and this forced conscription in Ukraine? Or is the Russian Federation doomed to slowly bleed to death as their forces get grinded down into a paste? Let's talk about it. First off, I'd like to apologize about my setup today. I know this is not the studio many of you are slowly getting used to, but due to my travels across Ukraine and trying to, be a journalist now, it means that I'm not going to always be in my Kiev studio, and I'll sometimes be at other locations and forced to record there. I hope you'll all forgive me. If you guys don't prefer this, I can do Dylan Cat in the future, which we did before, where we just had a what was it? What do they call them? The ranimation, rant sona. Yeah, I have a rant sona that I could use instead when it comes to circumstances like this. So if you're a Dylan Cat fan, please put in the comments that you would prefer Dylan Cat in the future instead of this. But today I wanted to talk to you guys about Russian manpower. The history of Russia is long and complex and very beautiful at times. But the thing is about Russian history, something that's been consistent, is that it has had an advantage against its enemies, whether it was Germany or the Great Britain and during the Crimean War or any of these other nations it has fought. And that advantage has always been manpower. Russia has the men. They're a very large country. It spans from Europe all the way to Asia. Dugin would even call them a Eurasian power, destined for greatness due to its geography. But it has a lot of men in its borders, men from Vladivostok, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Chechnya, all across the board. And that means it can throw a lot of men at wars. But for the first time in history, it seems that Russia is actually at a manpower disadvantage in a conflict, even though it has much more people in its population, and it has much more people in its military overall, which is quite strange to think about, but I can explain that. So obviously, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine on February 24th, but that doesn't mean it took everybody in its army in this invasion, because Russia never declared full-scale war, just a special military operation, which means that under Russian constitutional law, they can actually not send, due to Russian constitutional law, Russian conscripts to fight in Ukraine. It's against the Constitution. Now, that's not to say that the Russian government respects the Russian Constitution, but legally speaking, they can't do that. And the Russian government has worked very hard to kind of push to its people that they're not going to send conscripts, that this is not a war. They've even made it illegal to call this a war, and you can get 10 to 15 years in prison for doing so. This is a special military operation, even though it very obviously is a war. But that means also, since they can't send conscripts, that there's a cap on the amount of troops they can send. They can send professional soldiers, they can send people who volunteer with military contracts, but they can't send conscripts. And so originally the Russians didn't think this would be an issue because the war was only supposed to last 3 days. But now that it's dragged on for nearly 200, that manpower shortage, that lack of maneuverability when it comes to conscripts and people outside of the professional military service and the volunteers is becoming quite the problem for the Russian Federation. Definitely since the Pentagon is talking about the Russian Federation possibly taking over 80,000 casualties in the war so far. And that was early last month. It's been a month since then. And in that month since then, we've seen numbers rolling in of the Russian Federation taking hundreds upon hundreds of casualties a day, especially with the recent Kherson offensive, which has been grinding down Russian forces in Kherson. And I've been seeing so much footage of just overrun Russian positions where they just abandon it, and they're losing tons of tanks, tons of trucks every day, armored personnel vehicles, and their battalion tactical groups are being shredded as they're getting hammered with artillery, HIMARS, and their logistics are getting torn up. This is on top of the fact that their battalion tactical groups that they sent into the country were already understaffed before the war, and now they're more understaffed than ever. So these conditions with, poor logistics and not getting proper supplies and getting torn to shreds has also led to many Russian soldiers refusing the fight. And with them refusing to fight, that means less people on the battlefield and more problems as they have to circle out troops and cycle in new soldiers, and just the whole thing is a mess. And it's not a surprise that their battalion tactical groups are understaffed, certain Russian soldiers are refusing to fight, and it's difficult for them to get new recruits when support for the war is also slowly decreasing. We're seeing for the first time ever under 50% of Russians actually saying, and this is publicly to pollsters where they know a lack of support for the war could get them in legal trouble, saying that, they don't actually support continuing the war, and 44% in that same poll saying they would actually support peace at this time. Now contrast this with the Ukrainian armed forces, which is on track to have 1 million soldiers in the near future. A military which is highly motivated because of what the Russian army has done in Ukraine. We could talk about Bucha or more recent examples of Ukrainian textbooks in occupied territory being burnt and replaced with Russian chauvinistic textbooks. We could look at the polling data showing that 89% of Ukrainians don't want to make any territorial concessions at all, which includes Crimea, by the way, and over 98% of Ukrainians. I checked the methodology on this. I hate when I see numbers like this because I almost always assume it's fraudulent, it's fake, because it's impossible to get that much of a consensus. But 98% of Ukrainians believing in victory. I checked the methodology. It seems to be legit, even if it was off by 8%, 9%, 10%. There was a 2% gap that it could be wrong on, a 2% margin of error. Even if it was off by 10 points, that's still massive. There's a massive will to fight in Ukraine. So this idea that, Ukraine is going to smash and the lines are going to collapse very soon, so these manpower shortages won't be a long-term issue, you can kind of brush that aside. So Russia needs to find, if it wants to win the war, not that I want it to, a solution to this manpower shortage, because this war isn't going anywhere anytime soon. So how is Russia going to deal with this massive manpower issue? Well, I've heard some people say that they could just use propaganda and motivate its population to increase the amount of support for it, but not only increase the amount of support, but increase the amount of people who are willing to go fight and die in the war by showing the evil of the Ukrainian forces. Here's actually an example of that. This is an example of a Chechen soldier giving a pep talk to the rest of the soldiers, telling them what they're fighting for.
И если мы с вами не хотим, чтобы наши дети росли среди этой ЛГБТ, мы должны, во-первых, сделать так, чтобы у нас ее не было, и должны помочь всем народам, которые находятся на той стороне, освободиться от этой маленькой кучки шайтана.
So, let me give you a quick quote of the message that they're pushing here. So that our children do not grow up with this LGBT, we have to make sure it doesn't exist here where we are, and we have to help those nations on the other side to free themselves from this little grouping of shaitan, which means devil. So, if you were a Chechen soldier, listening to this speech, are you going to go to Ukraine and fight and die because kissing boys is icky to you? Are you going to fight an international struggle against the globo homo? Are you going to go get torn up by Ukrainian machine guns, anti-tank mines, Bayraktars, HIMARS, artillery? Because boy hug boy, ew, ew, ew? Probably not. Russian propaganda has been ringing pretty hollow as of recent, and I don't think that the escalating rhetoric of Russian state television is going to be enough to pump out more recruits. So they have to use other tactics outside of just propaganda. They need to maybe use more forceful tactics or incentives, which we've seen kind of foment itself in this concept known as shadow mobilization. So let's talk about some of the things that are falling under this shadow mobilization that a lot of the media are talking about. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the more forceful measures that the Russian Federation are using to try to make up for this massive shortage in manpower, and that is the forceful conscription of Ukrainians in occupied territory. We're talking about in the Kherson region, we're talking about in locations around Zaporozhye and Donetsk and Luhansk, all across the board, this forceful conscription of Ukrainian people. This is particularly going on in the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. By the way, before I go on and talk about the exact methods that are used, I just want to emphasize that this is a war crime. Under international law, this is clearly defined as a war crime. The Geneva Convention clearly states that forced mobilization is explicitly prohibited by the 1949 Geneva Convention for the Protection of Civilian Populations in Times of War. Under Article 51 of the Convention, the occupying power shall not compel protected persons to serve in its armed or auxiliary forces or to perform any work involving their participation in military operations. So, to be clear, this is a war crime. So Russia has already had to bend international law and commit a war crime in order to try to fulfill these shortfalls when it comes to manpower. So what the Russian Federation has been doing is mobilization raids. What they do is they get a bunch of police officers and auxiliary forces and whoever they can get into a van. They go to a location, raid it, and start grabbing people and saying, congratulations, you just won the prize of being in our military. You have now been drafted. They are doing this at bars. They're doing this at all locations all across Ukraine. In fact, they're even doing this at preschools. One example, which is particularly terrible, is a ambush that took place outside of a local preschool that caught the local fathers off guard as they were dropping off their children and trying to pick them up after school. What they did is they waited until it was time to pick them up. The fathers would come, and then the local occupying force would grab the parents, saying, congratulations, you've been drafted, in front of their children, causing quite the ruckus. This type of environment where people against their will are being forced to serve in the military, and these ambushes and raids that are taking place in the occupied territory has led to a lot of the streets in Donetsk and Luhansk just being completely empty because the men are in hiding. They're scared of being just grabbed off the street and said, congratulations, you are now going to go into the meat grinder. Here's 30 days of training, a really shitty rifle. Please be our body armor. You go first wave. And so a lot of people don't like those circumstances and so have gone into hiding in people's cellars and people's attics, or they just straight up just don't leave their homes because they're scared of being drafted. Now, I don't think I need to explain why these people are not going to make great soldiers. They're not going to hold a lot of loyalty because, number one, these are people being forced to fight from occupied territory. So many of them might actually hold loyalties towards Ukraine. They're not going to have a lot of training because these people are getting trained in a very short period of times. And their morale is going to generally be shot because they were forced to fight. And many of them are literally trying to avoid state officials because they don't want to be forced to fight. So they're not going to have high morale. They might surrender quite quickly. And the casualty numbers coming in for these forcefully mobilized troops from occupied territory are much higher than for a normal professional Russian soldier, giving another motivation for these people to avoid combat since they're quite frankly being used as kind of like human shields almost. They go in, they soften them up, they get slaughtered, then the professional Russian soldiers come in afterwards. So this isn't going to make up for the shortfall because a lot of these people are not going to be great soldiers. Many of them are avoiding the draft and are in hiding because they don't want to be forcefully mobilized. So what other tools does the Russian Federation have in its belt? Well, one, and it's pretty obvious, is larger incentives. You know, if you offer more pay, better benefits, a higher enlistment fee, then maybe locals across Russia would be more willing to sign up for service. And that is actually what the Institute for the Study of War talked about on July 16th with one of its written up reports on what the Russian Federation is doing. Let me just read a little bit from that report. The Russian Federation has launched a large-scale drive to form volunteer battalions in the 85 federal subjects or regions that comprise the Federation. Recruiting for some volunteer battalions began in June, but has intensified in July, with new volunteer units being reported daily. The battalions apparently will consist of roughly 400 men, each aged between 18 and 60. They will belong to various branches of service, including motorized rifle, tank, and naval infantry, but also signals and logistics. Recruits, and this is a very important part, are not required to have prior military service, so these are people with very little experience, and will undergo only 30 days of training before being deployed to Ukraine. This drive will likely produce soldiers of a lower quality than most normal conscripts in the Russian army at close to professional soldier prices. It is a remarkable expedient to suggest that the Russian President Vladimir Putin remains unwilling to compel his people to fight and unable to attract them to fight voluntarily without considerable incentives. And so exactly how much are they offering to get these low quality 30-day training, no prior military experience having soldiers to the front line? Quite a lot. They actually say in the report that the recruitment effort will likely be expensive if it comes close to meeting its targets. It appears that the Russian Ministry of Defense will pay volunteer salaries, while the federal subjects will pay their enlistment bonuses. Salaries generally start at roughly $3,000 per month per soldier, or about $1.2 million per month per 400-man unit. Enlistment bonuses offered by at least some units appear to be roughly a month's salary. If the effort generates 85 battalions, each of 400 men, it would bring an additional 34,000 volunteers into the fight at the cost of about $102 million per month in salary alone. That doesn't include food, that doesn't include supplies, doesn't include transportation, it doesn't include housing, it doesn't include any of the other things that you would need to, maintain a soldier's daily life in combat. Considering that the 30 days of training the volunteers will receive before entering combat will not produce combat-ready soldiers, that price is very high indeed. And it also goes on to talk about how these same soldiers, after the war's over, will also need to have veterans benefits, after the war's over, meaning that this is going to be a long-term cost that the Russian Federation is going to be taking on. And this is all at the same time when the Russian economy is being battered the most, where we're seeing 40 to 60% inflation in industries like the technology sector in Russia. We're seeing the Russian stock index crash by 50%. We're seeing the Russian economy in shambles in many ways due to that recent Yale study that I've talked about so much on this channel. And when the Russian economy is in the worst position to pay much more for its soldiers, that's when it's paying much more for its soldiers. I've actually seen some offers of like $6,000 per month. I mean, crazy amounts of money. And this isn't just going to affect the federal budget. The enlistment fees, as it said in this report, is actually going to be covered locally, meaning that local governments are also going to be paying for the enlistment fees. That'd be like if the Wisconsin state government paid the enlistment fee for soldiers joining the army during the Iraq War. So this doesn't only strain the budget of the federal government, this also strains the budget of local governments in Russia. Local governments which desperately need cash, as many of them have their economies in shambles, especially the ones that relied on things like the automobile industry to function and the automobile industry to employ the majority of its people, since the automobile industry has seen an 84% decrease in the amount of automobile sales going on. And so they're producing lower quality troops at a much higher price. The Russian government also has not been the most consistent in paying these much higher prices when it comes to monthly salary. There's been reports all across the board of Russian soldiers not being paid what they were promised going into service, leading to many Russian soldiers, of course, spreading this information online and then undercutting the efforts of the Russian government to recruit because they're told, yeah, you'll get $6,000 maybe one day if they actually pay you. And I don't want to undersell the fact that so many Russian soldiers are coming home injured or in coffins, and that is also going to discourage a large amount of the population from wanting to go fight in Ukraine. I don't think that the amount of dead Russian soldiers and injured Russian soldiers is not playing into it at all for the amount of people that are refusing to sign up for military service. I don't like to die. I think most of the people watching this would probably not like to die. And so it isn't hard to understand how getting all these reports out of Kherson of entire units just being nearly wiped out is going to not motivate you to join the Russian military. But despite all these factors, the Russian government is still desperately trying to expand the amount of soldiers they have fighting in Ukraine. They can't even maintain the amount of soldiers they have fighting in Ukraine right now in areas like Kherson, but they're trying to expand it. Vladimir Putin recently said that he wanted to expand the Russian armed forces by 137,000 troops to be deployed to Ukraine. Now, a lot of people saw this. I saw Lauren Boebert reacted to this on Twitter and a few others saying, oh, wow, look at this. I mean, poof, looks like the Ukrainians are really in for it. What a lot of people don't understand is they're just saying we would like to get 137 new volunteers. We're going to put that number down on a piece of paper. But just because you have that number down on a piece of paper doesn't mean you're going to have those many troops. You're still going to need people to go volunteer. All the recruitment issues the Russian Federation has are still going to exist, even if they say we need 137,000 new men. I could say to you guys, I need $5 million new dollars to launch my second channel, but me writing that number down on a piece of paper doesn't mean I just get $5 million new dollars. The Russian Federation is going to have a huge issue filling up that 137,000 troops that they want for the official expansion. It's going to end up, I can almost guarantee you that whatever they get out of this expansion is going to be terribly understaffed, and they're not going to hit that number under any circumstances. That is, outside of one circumstance. And that is the most obvious solution to Russia's problems that have been talked about since the beginning of the war. And that is the fact that the Russians don't recognize this as a war. They haven't declared war. This is a special military operation. This was something that was used to reassure the civilian population of Russia that their lives wouldn't change that much. Then, the laws banning declaring this a war rolled out. We saw so many people getting sent to Ukraine to die. We saw the economy crash. I'm sure the average Russian has had their life affected by the war pretty drastically, whether they like it or not. But this was one of the aspects the Russian government guaranteed the people, that we would not do full mobilization. And that's a difficulty for the Russian government, because that's the most obvious solution for their problems, because then they could send conscripts to the front line with no constitutional issues. So why aren't they doing full mobilization? Well, there's a few reasons. If after 200 days of fighting in a war that was supposed to last 3 days, you all of a sudden declare full mobilization, what does that say about your performance in the country, where on state media you're constantly saying, oh, we're doing great, everything's fine. Probably going to say it's actually not fine, that there's actually a massive problem with your military's performance in Ukraine, and you might need help. And now you're going to point to your civilian population, the middle-class Muscovite in Moscow, to actually go to Ukraine to fight, which is Putin's base of support. If he loses that base of support, it's going to be hard to imagine Vladimir Putin staying in power. He needs that middle-class support if he wants to stay the leader of Russia. Definitely with so many oligarchs frowning more and more upon the war as it drags on, and the sanctions just drag their companies over the coals. You can't, if you promised that it was going to be a special military operation and then you declare full mobilization, then that's Putin going back on his promise in public. So that means you're deploying the middle-class Muscovite that you need to maintain your support to Ukraine, to get slaughtered, by the way. And you're going back on a promise you made earlier in the conflict. And this is all on top of the fact that just declaring full mobilization doesn't immediately solve these issues. You still got to train the people that you're going to be sending to Ukraine. You still need to equip them well. And most likely, they're going to get poor training, just like these volunteer battalions that are only getting 30 days of training, and they're going to get poor equipment. And this is on top of the fact that you're going to need logistics to sustain these new troops, which the Russians have already had problems with due to how effective the Ukrainians have been in using HIMARS. Just look at Kherson right now. It's completely cut off. The Russians there are getting grinded down into a paste. So really, the Russian government is in an extremely difficult position. They're between a rock and a hard place. There's no good answer to this. They could continue this use of shadow mobilization to low effect, which doesn't solve the issue at all, or they could fully mobilize, but then piss off their base of support, not necessarily immediately solve the issue, spend a ton more money on the war, and also raise the stakes to a higher level. And if they lose after fully mobilizing and declaring a war, and they have to withdraw, oh my God, the political repercussions of that will be immense, extremely immense. It's hard to imagine Putin surviving a political situation like that. So right now, Putin's not in a good position to really fully address the issue, either through full mobilization, which is not really that viable, or shadow mobilization, continuing what they're doing now, which is unsustainable. Meaning that right now it looks like, if things continue as they are, Russia is slowly bleeding to death. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. If you want to know a great way to support my channel, it's my Patreon. I'm pushing it super hard right now. Every dollar that goes into that Patreon goes into my reporting in Ukraine, whether it's out there filming, paying for cameramen, paying editors, paying for thumbnails, or anything I'm doing here. It 100% goes to that, and I would really appreciate if you supported me on Patreon. You could also follow me on Twitter at DylanBurns1776, or you could join our Discord and chat with all the other people who like to watch the channel. Thank you so much. I appreciate your viewership, and you guys have a great week.